Hello and welcome to my first podcast episode. I am Jamie Hudson and today we will be talking about the historic video game Assassin's Creed 3 and why this time period is so important to talk about. Today I'll be joined by a good friend of mine who I've known for a very long time and who I've studied history with and is a fellow film buff just like me. His name is Sebastian and we will be calling him in a second to discuss this topic. I just wanted to welcome you to my channel. This is the first time I've done a video and I do hope that you enjoy, and let's begin. So we'll be calling Seb now. Hopefully he picks up, or that would be incredibly embarrassing. Hello Sebastian.
Hello. How's it going?
Good, thank you. Oh bloody hell, who's that?
That's something in my background. I'll stop it now, don't worry.
Well, thank you for joining me on my podcast today.
Absolutely no problem.
And you're fully aware of what we'll be talking about?
Exactly. I'm very excited to talk about Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed and what the product means in relation to the industry, the influence it had.
And you know it, mate, because me and you played this game for a very long time, haven't we?
We have, and I think it's kind of formed a fundamental part of our past, our youth.
Oh, definitely. I think looking back,
absolutely,
I think what we remember as children is playing these games that kind of broaden our horizons and, create these worlds that obviously we never lived in. Well, these time periods that we never lived in, and we get to explore them through these games.
Exactly, and we are allowed to see the perspectives of what an individual, how they would live in such different time periods with different, and how the political context affects that, the situation there.
Yeah, well, the context of Assassin's Creed is it takes, historic periods and kind of mixes them in with this fiction, the assassins and the Templars, and kind of mixes them in with, the political ideas that are going on at the time, because this is quite an important time period. I think this is the age of enlightenment, where countries and people are starting to develop their own ideas. Revolutions are happening all across the world. I think it's a fundamental part of history, and I think it's important that the franchise covered this time period.
Exactly, and it covered it in quite it was achieved through quite nuanced way. As you see, the Templars were the established antagonists of the series, and we see that through their actions, their methods to gain power. But in Assassin's Creed 3, I think it very smartly, it gives it on a platter to you. They're not entirely bad. What they actually want to achieve is moral. It's a moral thing to do.
Yeah, no, I get
However, of course, that conflicts with the ideology of the assassins, especially Connor, who was very much a fundamental part of the context, as of course he was a Native American, and that was very much the main source of interest, both the Templars and the British. And of course, he's kind of rooted between the conflict, and he's trying so hard to do what's right by his people.
Yeah, and you're totally right there. I think this game does give us two different perspectives. I think previously in games it's always been, with the ACIII collection, I love it, but I definitely think that the Templars are the bad guys, definitely in that. The Borgias, horrible people, and that's known in history. And the assassins are definitely seen as the people who deliver freedom to the people, these Italian states. But I think in this game we kind of we get two different perspectives. I think especially when we obviously start the game as ACIII as well, we kind of see that induction into the Templar Order. We see it's quite similar to the assassins in that regard, isn't it? The induction and the kind of what they stand, what they believe in. It's not evil, is it? It's what I mean. It's just what they think is right.
Exactly, and that's the interest, right? The allure. None of these two sides are completely right. None of them are wrong. None of them is more evil than the other. It's just the methods they seek to gain power are different.
Yeah, and I think the assassins. I think especially in this time period, they're seen as quite weak, and I think if you've played Assassin's Creed Rogue, you can see that the assassins are actually they're led on to be quite bad, for what they've done in that game. If you remember
Yeah.
that game.
Exactly. The Colonial Brotherhood is presented as a kind of the antithesis of what the Assassins are meant to be.
Yeah.
The Assassins are meant to be the heralds of liberty. They're trying to free the world, but in the end, what Rogue presents is the Assassins are also after something. They've got their own agenda,
Yeah.
whether that's political or social, and it's the Templars, or let's say specifically Shay, who takes arguments with that, and he eventually breaks all ties to the Brotherhood.
Yeah, and then he joins the Templars, who he believes are doing the right thing morally.
Exactly.
So I think
morality is a huge part in both games, because morality is never presented as fully light. Like, there's a grey area.
Yeah.
We see that through the character of Haytham, or even Connor. Haytham kills innocent people because either they've done some wrong, or they obstruct what he's trying to achieve. Whereas Connor, yes, he's trying to do right by his people, but he's also clouded by a sense of anger.
Well,
he judges others based on their allegiance and their motives.
Yeah, and that's where we see he's a bit reckless throughout the game, especially when he first meets up with his father. Obviously, he's got a lot of hard feelings there. But what I find interesting about that is that all his anger is directed at Charles Lee because he believes that he is the one who burnt his village. But we find out at the end of the game that the people who Connor has aligned himself with, George Washington and this new American Free State, are actually the ones who burnt his native village and killed his mother.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting when, Connor seeks to identify himself with the democratic ideal, but on the other hand, we see in a crucial moment between Haytham, Haytham's monologue actually rather, when he says, I've kind of heard the Constitutional Congress shout and stamp all in the name of liberty, but it's all just noise. It kind of shows that Haytham's deeply aggrieved at what the revolution stands for.
Yeah.
And that even says that Washington has his own ego. Just like Charles Lee, but Charles Lee perhaps presents the more practical methods of, achieving power, achieving what's right for the American nation.
Yeah. I think that's so clear throughout the game. And I think that's why I enjoy this game so much, because, like I said, we do get these two different perspectives. And another thing I noticed at the end when you complete Assassin's Creed 3 is Connor's kind of looking around him in Boston, and he kind of sees, that there's still, there's still slaves being sold. There's still people getting hurt in the streets. There's still people that aren't happy with the new American state, because obviously there were still British loyalists, and not everyone's being treated fairly. So, Connor has this idea that we see in the previous games, about what the assassins represent. But then in this game, what the assassins represent just isn't there. Do you know what I mean? That idea of freedom and stuff, because that freedom still doesn't exist for many people, like these slaves that we see, and people have British loyalists having tomatoes thrown at them and stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly what I was saying, kind of, and what you've very clearly stated. There is no right or wrong in the game. Morality is presented through very grey colour.
Yeah.
Everyone does something controversial in order to achieve what's right for them in a way.
Yeah.
There is certainly, everyone has their own ego. Even Connor has his own ego.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah. Connor has, he does have an ego, but he is willing to follow the assassin order, and he's willing to follow Achilles, who is a wounded assassin.
The mentor.
Yeah, the mentor, who we talk about as being kind of in Assassin's Creed Road, this kind of selfish, kind of wants to show off a bit, in a sense that he wants to capture all these apples of all these elements of Eden and stuff before the Templars, and obviously what we see happens in that game is that because he's so reckless about it, that he ends up destroying Lisbon, which causes the Lisbon earthquake, and that obviously makes Shay, the protagonist in that game, join the Templars. So yeah, obviously we keep going back to this idea of the assassins not always being right, and I think for me that's what I enjoy most about this game. It's just the idea that we're kind of given these two different perspectives, and I think that's what makes the game so great. Obviously, when the game first came out, it didn't receive such good recognition because it was a massive like drift away from what we've seen in different previous Assassin's Creed games that were kind of set, Renaissance, late medieval, early medieval, with Assassin's Creed 1. And, I think the franchise took a massive turn, but I think it took a good turn. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what ACIII helps to understand is the complexity of characters, and especially because no other game in the franchise had done it, it did present both sides as the morally good.
Yeah.
And it's quite important if we choose to analyse Connor's character, the guy who was killed in the forest, because he loses hope, if you remember.
Yeah, of course.
And that's interesting because that example is when, what someone fears when that sense of authority is stripped away. There is no connection between that of the individual and that of the higher authority. He was afraid. He lost all hope. But I think that's deeply important.
And you couldn't have put You could not have put that any better, honestly. But yeah, I think what's significant about this game is that the little details that they leave in to kind of show, it's how do I put this? It's kind of like just to show that that equality still doesn't exist even once you complete the game and you think that you've achieved assassin supremacy and everyone's free and everything like that. And that's when you're crossing on the frontier between going to New York or Boston to the homestead, obviously where you live, and that's you're always wanted. You're always if you're seen on the frontier by British or even, this is the thing, because obviously when the country exchanges hands to the American revolutionaries, even when the American revolutionary people are obviously in charge, they will shoot you on sight if they see you on the frontier. So it's like no Native Americans on the frontier, because obviously Connor is a Native American. And I really find that really interesting. That's a nice little detail from Ubisoft.
Yeah. And let me ask you a question. Do you think the Native Americans have any predetermined sense of destiny, or as the game presents, were they always meant to become manipulated or drawn into the political context and forced to choose a side?
Well, this is what I find sad. I think if we're talking real history, I think the Native Americans have always, had to choose a side. I mean, obviously, Native Americans, they are the natives of, North America and obviously South America as well. But, one thing that happened differently is when the Spanish conquered South America, they integrated with the natives. But when the British, French, Dutch came to North America, we kind of pushed them aside. We kind of said, join us because we can use your... we can use your people for numbers. We can give you this land, we can give you these riches. In exchange, we'll give you this section of land and leave you in peace. But in reality, that wasn't actually going to happen. And unfortunately, a lot of Native Americans believed that they could trust, the white man. But in reality, I don't think that they could.
Yeah.
And I think that in this game, they're all living peacefully. The Native Americans are living peacefully, and suddenly, these colonialists come along and their village is burnt down, but we find out at the end of the game it's actually George Washington who did it. So British or American, there isn't this love for Native Americans that we see in the game, and I think it's quite sad because a lot of Native Americans, you do missions where you actually have to kill Native Americans as Connor, which is quite sad because obviously they're his own people, but they've been it's been put in their head that the Americans or the British, whoever's manipulating these Native Americans, are bad, and I think that's quite sad to see. But I think it's good that is included in the game. If that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. What happened to the Native Americans was a tragedy. The game explores that in quite enough depth, mostly through subtle character conversations and interactions. Yeah. We see it through actually. I think was it William Johnson, maybe?
Yeah, that's him.
His attempts to parlay with the Native Americans.
Yeah, he's a British general.
Connor's way.
Sorry, for more context.
Yeah.
He's a British general, but he's also a Templar, yeah.
that's important. So when you made this British general, this desire to oppress the peoples, the tribes, and it came from all stratas of society. It wasn't just, the common man who wanted to see, England expand their glory, but it was very much the nobility as well.
Oh, definitely. I agree, and I obviously I said I look for little details, and one that I find is as I'm strolling along the frontier, as Connor, gliding through, because he's moving very fast, obviously, isn't he? He's very fast, but I always see one Native American just strolling along the pathway alone, and I find that quite sad, because if you go back to this native camp where Connor lived with his family, and where his mother unfortunately died, and where the apple of Eden is first buried, it's quite sad because there's no one left there, and to find a Native American after completing the game, it is quite hard. It is difficult. There's one I found dead, where this kind of treasure chest, this trinket is hidden. But yeah, I've only seen 2 Native Americans other than Connor since completing the game. So I think that is quite sad.
And let me ask you a question: do you think the Native Americans are left more divided by the end of the game than they are at the start of the game?
Well, I think, honestly, to answer that question, I think by the end of the game they are less divided because they've all taken off, they've all moved on, but because they know they have to. They know they can't live. Obviously it's in the frontier, so that a lot of British are out there in the frontier hunting and bringing back goods, and then a lot of Americans are out there building up their new economy, and they know they just can't live side by side with them because there is that discrimination. So I think at the beginning of the game, where the Native Americans are a lot more involved, I think that there is that divide, between helping the British or helping the revolutionaries. But I don't really think that there is that help for the revolutionaries there, because obviously, George Washington not a big fan of Native Americans, but yeah, I find that an interesting concept, because I feel like at the beginning of the game, the Native Americans are. They're still fighting their own fight. The fight that they've been fighting for about 200 years now against, the white man who's come over. But then by the end of the game, they're kind of, they've all moved on. They've given up. There isn't that divide. There just isn't that eagerness to fight because, they know they've lost, even though
they've lost all hope. Yeah.
Well, even though the country's exchanged hands now, they still know they've lost. They know things aren't going to get better still. And unfortunately, they just take that and move on. Because it is quite sad. Because obviously, Connor goes back to his home village, and no one's there because they've all moved on. They've all moved on. All the warriors, a lot of the younger warriors, Connor had to kill himself because, like I said before, they've been indoctrinated by, by the white man and stuff like that. So it is quite sad.
Yeah.
But obviously, that divide does exist to the end of the game. But as we go through the game, there's less and less native presence. But even though as we go through the game, we're meant to be progressing more, to this American way, this American Constitution and stuff. But really, in reality, things like the Native Americans, they're fading away, and that is quite sad.
And do you think so? Of course, throughout the game, the Native Americans are very much presented as living on the margins of, let's say, political enlightenment, and they're certainly neglected. So, of course, there are a very large consequence. Their tragedy, their sufferings are one of the consequences that come out of this revolution. Do you think there is any attempt to, to give recompense or apology? Is that visible throughout the game, or
what from the British and Americans?
Exactly.
No, there is throughout the game. There is none at all. I think even what was it the? I'm trying to think back. Sorry, is it the? The Boston Massacre. Yeah, so that is
right.
So in history, obviously that happened because these a couple of Americans were getting a bit rowdy and some British soldiers were getting attacked. But in the game, it shows Haytham. shooting one of the soldiers, and then obviously the British soldiers think that's the civilians. But I'm pretty sure because Connor's there as well. That blame is put on Connor. So the Templars believe that. No, what is it? I think that so the Templars, what they believe in is not Native American, but also what the assassins don't believe in is not Native American. And going back to that point about the Boston massacre. Sorry, I've got a bit of a runny nose today. Apologies.
That's fine.
Going back to that point about the boss, but yeah, sorry. Going back to that point I made. Connor is there. He's a native, and he's seeing firsthand, the white man fighting each other. Do you know what I mean? The British shooting these Americans. The white man fighting each other, and I think at that point he knows that if the white man is willing to shoot one another, then I don't really think they're going to care much for the sympathies of Native Americans. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you say, Connor is presented as a very isolated character.
Yeah.
His brother dies early, of course, in a fire that destroyed the village. Achilles is present, of course, he's the mentor, but there is no, fatherly connection between them, a paternal affection.
Oh, definitely.
Connor?
Yeah, definitely.
Connor is very much left alone to fight this war.
Yeah,
both
that's a good
revolution,
I think there's
but also the internal conflict within it.
Yeah, no. I think there's no better way of talking about, obviously, would you say, this kind of, forgivingness of the white man to Native Americans. I don't think there's any better way of seeing that from the perspective of Haytham and his son Connor. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And even though Connor is his son, he is willing to work with him and stuff like that. And I think just like the white man, the British or the Americans, they are willing to work with the Native Americans, but only to use them. Yeah. Just like Haytham uses his son, to gain information, to gain entry into places. I think that is just like how the British / Americans / French kind of use the Native Americans. You know what I mean?
Indeed, but I'd argue that there is some sort of affection from Haytham towards Connor.
Oh, I definitely see that. I
especially in this dying moment.
Yeah,
he says in his speech.
He says, "I'm proud of you," doesn't he?
I'm proud of you. I should have killed you long ago. It shows that he respects him and seen what he's grown into.
Yeah.
But because of the situation he's in, and of course the tragic events of his past life, like the murder of his father, Edward Kenway, by the Reginald Birch, who was affiliated with the Templars, he's kind of forced into this conflict, and by the end of it, despite his desire to see the Templars win, I think there is an epiphany in him that he realizes this war is going to drag on.
Yeah.
No one's going to win.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think we're moving on. I think we should talk more about I think we should have less of a focus now on the Assassins and Templars, but more about the civilized society and from the perspective of the people in this conflict. And I think it's presented really well in the game. I think if you're going around the streets of Boston, especially early on in the game, as Haytham, you play as you start as Haytham the Templar. I think you see a lot of upset and aggravation from the Americans, the settlers towards the British, and I think that's presented really well in this game. Do you think that's something that's presented really well?
I think so, and when you talk about the perspective of the people, you see that through the Boston Tea Party.
Oh, definitely.
And you can clearly see that the civilized world is an absolute tatters. There is this desire to unleash this anger that's inside them.
Yeah.
They feel disillusioned with the hierarchy that established all these decisions, all these choices for them, and they've had no say in it.
Yeah.
So of course, this leads up to some tension and angst that grows inside them.
Yeah.
And eventually, they're not fighting for either side, but they're fighting for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Because this is one of my favourite historic periods, so I absolutely love it, and I know that you do as well. And I think it's brilliant that we have this game to kind of tell that to tell that story from a certain perspective. Obviously, what I find significant about this time period is that it's this idea about I think that the American colony, the American settlers, I think they could have remained British. But I think London was very, very harsh on the 13 colonies. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. I think it comes on this idea of crown policy, this imperialist expansion, and it's tragic. It results when you kind of see the Constitutional Congress as acting as the antithesis of this colonialist struggle.
Yeah, well, they start out as messengers, kind of this communication between London and
right.
These higher up American people, who were British loyalists before. I mean, George Washington himself was a British general who quite significantly actually began the French Indian War. That was the first battle that took place in this conflict. But yeah, going back on that, but obviously, London just wasn't having it. They did underestimate the Americans, and I think that they were winning the war, to be quite frank, until obviously the intervention of the French and the Spanish. But obviously, all these taxes and stuff, they did come from the 7 Years' War, the conflict that took place, 10, 15 years prior, and I think that's quite interesting to me. How harsh the British were on the Americans in terms of taxing and I guess treatment in government, because they didn't have any seats in London, and they're kind of just left out. And I think that the game really does show this quite well. You're quite involved with the Continental Congress, and I find that really interesting. To be quite frank with you, that you get to hang out with Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and all these significant historic figures. James Madison. I think it's really interesting.
And to what extent would you argue that the kingdoms of Spain, France, Vermont Republic, and the Dutch Republic played in the offensive against the British?
Sorry, mate. Do you think you can repeat that?
Absolutely. To what extent do you think? How effective was the involvement of the Dutch Republic, Vermont Republic, Kingdom of France and Spain in the war effort?
Oh, it was so significant. I think because the conflicts, so pretty much when the French and Spanish intervened, the British were worried that their Indian territories would be affected by the French, because French also had a lot of interest in the Indian Ocean. So what the British did is they withdrew a lot of troops from the American colonies and moved them to the Indian Ocean, in the Indian outpost, because obviously there was a lot of trade coming from there, and a lot of British ships were being bombarded and by French, Spanish, and the Dutch, obviously, like you said, and I do find this very interesting, because even the British had to involve their sister nation, the Kingdom of Hangover, and get troops from there and troops from Bavaria, and it was just a very costly war. We had to cut a lot of spending, and that's quite difficult to do in war. I think the only thing about this game that I would say I would like to have seen was more of a narrative from the British side, because obviously we get more of a narrative from the Templar side. We get this narrative from the Assassin side, and we get this idea about America. I would also have liked early on in the game to see Haytham more involved with with the British, because obviously he quite is, but he's also just going around killing a lot of British troops. But I would have liked to have seen him involved in some of the early conversations and conflicts, and I think that would have been quite interesting. But I think the British idea is shown pretty well throughout the game. But I think because obviously what the Templars stand for is what the British stand for, at that moment in time. But I think what I'd like to see is an expansion DLC where we're kind of taken, to this perspective of maybe a Templar who's a bit higher up than Haven. Do you know what I mean? What's the like before Haven becomes Grand Master of the Colonials? I think
Right.
Obviously the Templars have a lot of branches. I'm thinking, possibly a branch out in India. I think I would have liked.
Right. Yeah.
No, but this idea, I know it sounds a bit confusing, but I would have liked to have seen the communication between the Colonial Templars and possibly these Templars in the Indian Ocean, and how they communicate their ideas, and how they're talking about how we can get more troops over here or more troops over there, how we can involve other countries to help us out. How can we manipulate these governments and do this and do that? Do you know what I mean? I think that'd be a cool DLC, because I think this is a really interesting time period. I think it is really, really interesting. But obviously, Assassin's Creed Unity, Assassin's Creed Rogue, and even to a certain extent, Assassin's Creed Black Flag are all kind of set around this time period, this age of enlightenment, which is quite interesting. And I would love to see it revisited in the game. What about yourself?
Exactly, and especially Black Flag. Because Black Flag very much, we see these notions of revolution arising in the game. We have Nassau and Edward, and the pirates fell witness to this global political transformation, trying to help those on the islands. And again, it plays into the idea that Britain was expanding to the Caribbean. It was mainly interested in the produce of rum.
Oh,
and
we all have a bit of rum, don't we?
Yeah, well, why not? But what my point is really, it very much, Black Flag does kind of stand for the same message that was produced and represented in ACIII.
Oh, definitely.
Edward is very much fighting his own revolution as well. Yeah. He's trying to change. And you see that in a really important scene. When he's standing with Adewale, and he says, for many years I've been running around chasing riches, not giving a tinker's curse to those that I've heard. But when I look at the course I've run, there's not a man or woman I love left standing beside me. And that's, you can easily attribute that to Connor as well. He's gone through so much, made choices, whether they were right or wrong, but they've resulted in emotional angst and outrage.
Yeah, I think this is why it's important that Assassin's Creed 3 was actually made before these other games that were set around the time period, even if they were set before. Do you know what I mean? The reason I say this is because of Assassin's Creed 3 that we get this kind of prequel in a way to Connor's granddad, Edward, and the building blocks that lead up to Assassin's Creed 3. And I think that Rogue obviously is a good expansion on that Templar colonial perspective. I think that's really good and really important. And I think that Unity is a really fun game in general. I think it's one of the best and most underrated in the series. How that conflict for the American colonies kind of backfires over to France, and France is obviously in a lot of debt, and there's a lot of upset, and they even have their own revolution, and that's quite interesting, because Europe at that time did not like revolutions, they did not like republics, they did not like people who were not born into authority to have authority, and I think that's quite interesting, because the French are obviously a kingdom, and they help out the Americans get their democracy, and then that ends up backfiring on them, and I always find that quite amusing.
But I think we need to establish a very important point of divergence between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The French Revolution was much more violent, arguably.
Definitely.
The Revolution, they pushed and pushed. There was political agenda in the French Revolution, and kind of Napoleon comes into this, and he kind of smooths over the rough edges, but through his own ascendancy to power, that chaos still exists, and the people are still very much left in the same position.
Yeah, I think this is a really, I do love this time period. I know I've said it before, but I do love this time period, and I think that's why Assassin's Creed 3 is one of my favourite Assassin's Creed games, and and Unity. So going back to that, this is, France. There's always been a lot of tension there because, there is this separation between the upper class and the lower class, and basically you would get a job, or you would get education based off who your family is. So if you were poor, you had no chance. If you had the knowledge, but you were poor, you had no chance. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's quite interesting because that's where the French Revolution comes in. And obviously we see this change.
Right. Each person was attributed to his own social class.
Yeah.
And those who were not born to nobility or rank were ultimately kind of neglected.
Yeah.
And kind of encouraged to find their own way, search their own opportunity.
I think that's quite interesting because obviously Napoleon becomes emperor, but he is from Corsica, a small island brought by the French, in 1763, I believe it was, and and he has this rise to fame, and that is partly because of the French Revolution that allowed him to do that. But then, do we believe that the French Revolution exists because of the American Revolution? No, because that tension always existed. But I'm just saying, I think that the French obviously helping out with the American Revolution. We kind of see these ideas of democracy come through. I think a lot of that, footprinted. What we see in the American Revolution about congresses and different representation all across the country coming together. But obviously, the French Revolution was very nasty, and the First Republic, was not very successful. Let's be honest.
I think exactly as you said, the American Revolutionary War does, it provides the basis for which the French Revolution can exact its own ideas.
Yeah.
And you could argue that some of its original, or the ideas that exist within, that spurred on the American Revolution, were somewhat manipulated during that of the French one.
Yeah. Yeah. I do just love this time period. I think it is incredible. I mean, what about yourself? Is this a preferred time period?
It's fascinating because we live in a time where mostly, we're ruled by democracy. The democratic ideal is quite, prevalent, is predominant to our society. And these great revolutions that happened some 100 years ago, they form our, attentiveness to what happened in the past, how it shaped our cultural identity.
Definitely.
In the modern day and age.
Well, I think... Sorry to interrupt you.
Please.
Especially in our country, Britain, and before that, the Kingdom of England, Scotland. This idea of democracy is always, it's always lived alongside the Constitution. The monarchy, and obviously from the signing of the Magna Carta, or just significant time periods like that, War of the Roses, or William of Orange, kind of passing over a significant amount of power to Parliament. I think that in this country, I think that's something that we've always done well, that balance between democracy and the right to rule. Do you know what I mean?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
And I think with the American Revolution, a lot of their democratic ideas are obviously British, because a lot of them were British, British or Irish. You know what I mean?
Exactly, and it shows how global this.
I think it shows the domino effect. A domino effect, definitely.
Yeah. It shows how global this push for democratic progress was as well.
But I find that quite funny because we always wanted that balance of power in Europe by maintaining monarchies, even though we ourselves we were a constitutional monarchy, but we were all for that full monarchy in Europe. Just that one person in charge, because I guess it made life a bit easier for us.
Right. I mean, I think monarchy represents something quite important to us all, whether we agree with it or not. Is this very much it forms the national cultural identity,
Definitely.
and the monarchy's been around for ages, so it's very much embedded in our culture.
Definitely.
I think that's very important that we understand that,
Oh, definitely.
and its effects on the attitudes.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look around the world today, most democracies do exist, and their constitutions are formed because of ideas, that have come from this country.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that is so clear in Assassin's Creed 3. Do you agree that this idea about democracy and the freedom, obviously, it's the Americans' freedom. It's what they think freedom is, obviously. So that's why we still see a lot of slaves and stuff like that. But it is freedom, and to them, and their ideas are British.
Certainly, Assassin's Creed 3 does a very good job of planting the notion that there is this fight for democratic progress.
Yep.
But it's very much blurred by, it's distorted. Mm-hmm. So we have Washington, having his own agenda with attacking the Native American tribes, whilst at the same time keeping up this image that
of course,
we have to live in peace. This idea of equality, and historically speaking, Washington is quite controversial on the topic of slavery.
Yeah.
I don't think he ever really truly believed in it. He never fought against it. He didn't pass any laws. We also know he owned a slave plantation, and upon his will, I believe, most slaves were freed.
But again, so,
the game does a good job of it because it provides the nuanced Washington character. Yes, he's trying to secure America's freedom, but at the same time, there are those things in the background
that the suffering of other people, essentially. Like British loyalists, for example, Native Americans.
Right.
Yeah.
That suffering is very clear, and the British. So, as you said, the suffering of the British loyalists, and rather their involvement in that suffering, isn't portrayed to an excellent effect.
No, it's not in the game. No.
It's been very much compressed to the Native Americans, the F8, the divisions within the tribes, and their neglection by the hierarchy.
Oh, definitely.
And Connor very much represents that. Oh. He's isolated. Yeah. He's disillusioned, and he represents that minority, which
definitely
can speak to us as a majority, but by the government, they were seen as a minority who didn't have the same value, didn't possess the same attributes as anyone else, really.
Yeah, but his character, he is alone. He is neglected by those around him, and that is it's how the Native Americans were viewed at that time period.
Exactly. Let me pose to you a question to wrap this up.
Oh, of course.
What do you think? How important do you think Assassin's Creed 3 is? Its impact on the industry, is it visible, and has it fermented other attempts to exhibit this diverse cultural identity, which connects us all?
Oh yeah. So definitely, I think we were talking about this cultural identity. I think in America, obviously, their cultural identity is their guns and their freedom and their liberty, and but I think. Obviously, I think that's shown throughout the game, but obviously at the suffering of other people, such as in Native Americans. But yeah, I think that the game represents this well. This idea that that two people, that say two best friends, one's British, one's American, both speak the same language, both have similar working lives. Could hate each other so much and believe in two different ideological things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
completely.
I think that is represented so well in the game. Yeah, and I think that there's no better way of showing that than between the comparison between Charles Lee and George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, they very much represent the authenticity to return. Charles Lee is prepared to use violence, and James knows he can't manipulate.
Yeah.
Washington, however, yes, he clearly inflicts violence, but he tries to cover this up by assuming this mantle of a good, honest, and honourable man.
Yeah. Well, I've got one final question for you before we wrap this up. Did you play the George Washington DLC of Assassin's Creed 3? The Tyranny of George Washington?
I did not know. I played the main game and that was it, really.
Oh, I played it and I find it very interesting, very interesting. George Washington becomes king, and obviously that was an idea that was explored around the time of his presidency.
Right, of course.
Yeah, and he's a dictator. He's got an apple of Eden. He's got a staff of Eden, and he is crazy. He is crazy, and it's a really fun DLC for that. So I recommend that. Well,
that's fascinating. So the DLC, as you say, it presents us with different possibilities of what the outcome of the Revolutionary War might have been.
Yeah. Yeah.
What would have happened if Washington was to take the name of king upon himself?
Yeah, and
what if there was an apple of Eden?
Of course, I think that's important that we've got that DLC. Sorry, yeah, because because we see the American troops committing war crimes and stuff like that because George Washington just turns into this tyrant because he's manipulated. He's completely he's not the same man that he was, and I really do enjoy that DLC. Really nice, really cool.
I will have to check it out at some point.
Yeah, well, definitely. Well, thank you for joining me today, Seb. I really enjoyed having you on, and it's always a pleasure to speak to you. I've known you for a very long time. We studied history together for a long time, and we did. We're both fanatics for this Assassin's Creed franchise, and I'm really happy you joined me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, no problem. Thank you very much for joining us. See you later. Bye.
Thank you. Enjoy. Bye.
Well, that was Sebastian and our conversation about Assassin's Creed 3 and surrounding that time period. And we really hope you enjoyed this video, with this podcast episode. And we'll be releasing this as a video on YouTube, so you can use subtitles and still listen to the audio. And this will be released on Spotify, so please check it out. And please wait for our next episode, which will be coming very soon, where I'll be discussing historic epics with my old history teacher, which should be really interesting. So please stick around for that. And thank you for listening, and goodbye.